Good morning, everybody. How are you today? I trust all is well. I'm Silene Rodrigues from PUC-Rio, and it's a pleasure to be with you again, serving as a host for another Abralinha ao Vivo session. Today, we have the honor of hosting a talk by Professor Arjen Stolk. Professor Stolk holds a PhD from the Donders Institute in Netherlands, and he's currently a professor at Dartmouth College, where he's directing an interesting project called Mutual Understanding. His research interests include cognitive neuroscience, interacting minds, electrophysiology, neuroimaging, and mental disorders that might alter pragmatics, such as autism. Today, he will share with us some of his research results and ideas. The title of his talk is Building a Shared Conceptual Space. At the end of the talk, we will count on Bruno Galantucci to comment on Stolk's talk, and we will also have questions from the YouTube chat. So please send us your questions. Professor Stolk, thank you for having accepted our invitation, and I hope you enjoyed being with us. Thank you. Arjen, you there? And I hope you enjoyed being with us. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Eileen, for this introduction. Let me see if I can start up my slides.
Arjen, you there?
Yeah, I'm here. Please,
and I hope you enjoyed being with us. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Eileen, for this introduction. Let me see if I can start up my slides. Hang on, I have to check. Okay, yes. Can you see my slides? Sarin, can you see my slides?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So you're seeing the, okay, yeah. Okay. My name is Arjen Stolk. I'm director of the Mutual Understanding Lab at Dartmouth and also at the Donders in the Netherlands. So the lab is split over two locations. Just to be clear, you're seeing this, right? You're seeing the BBC article now. Yeah, okay. So the questions we ask ourselves are, how do we understand one another? Despite differences in backgrounds and also private perspectives, how can we have meetings like today's, in which we will end up knowing things together that we didn't know before? And one might think that we can do this because we share the same set of communicative behaviors, such as words and gestures. However, that intuition neglects the extreme flexibility with which we employ our behaviors in everyday communicative situations. For instance, I can readily use the word bank in a conversation to refer to money, a place to fish, or it's also a basketball shot, as I've learned in the US. And without context, you cannot tell which one it is. Now, artificial intelligence is also finding out about this issue the hard way. For instance, Honda's Asimo, on its launch day as a museum guide, failed to differentiate between a hand raised for taking a photo and the hand raised for asking a question. Apple Siri, if you tell her that you like to go fishing at the riverbank, and then you ask her where you can find a nice bank, it will send you to the nearest Wells Fargo. And in fact, it used to be the case that if you told Siri you had a gambling problem, it would send you to the nearest casino. So somehow this is not an issue for us humans. We seem to be able to rapidly find relevant context for each other's intrinsically ambiguous behaviors. But the question is, how do people define what counts as context? And how does this context then determine the meaning of an utterance? And I think these are questions we need to begin asking if we want to know how communication works, but also if we want to know how it breaks down in disorders of communication, such as seen in frontotemporal dementia and autism. Okay, so in this talk, I will suggest that a large portion of the context is actually constructed on the fly by people themselves. So how? Well, even conventional communicative behaviors, such as words and gestures, do not have fixed meanings. Instead, people use them as a tool to probe, align, and shape their concepts of the interaction. And by doing so, by aligning their concepts, they're effectively creating a shared conceptual space that provides them with context for selecting and interpreting behaviors that can be mutually understood. So I will demonstrate this construction process in the next slide, but it's important to realize that if you manage to keep your conceptual structures of this talk aligned with mine, we will actually end up sharing a conceptual space ourselves. So that space will span previously unconnected concepts of Asimo, Siri, MEG, dual fMRI, but also autism and intracranial EEG. Anyone entering this meeting at a later point in time will have a hard time understanding what we're exactly talking about, since what we say will depend on this shared conceptual space. Okay, let me demonstrate you the need for constructing this shared conceptual space, this shared context in communication. Consider the following semantically incoherent, yet somehow conversationally fluent exchange between a customer and a bartender. A cup of Joe. We're closing in 5. Add 1 for the missus then. That'll be a $5. So I'm sure your brains have already made perfect sense of this semantically incoherent exchange by now, but let me try to spell out what I think the customer and the bartender needed to do to make this exchange work in the first place. Because a cup of Joe is not something you could say to anyone anywhere. So therefore, even before uttering it, before saying a cup of Joe, the customer would need to build a conceptual scaffold of information that approximates the scaffold presumably used by the bartender to interpret his utterance. So he might select background knowledge that coffee can be ordered from bars. He might, that bartenders might be familiar with slang words for coffee, such as Joe, and so on and so on. In fact, he might also need to prepare alternative scenarios at the same time as when the bartender is maybe a cleaner or the bar is closing, etc. Now, the bartender's reply, we're closing in 5, might seem logically unrelated to the customer's order, a cup of Joe, but it suffices to say that he's able and willing to process that order, allowing the two to add concepts of coffee to what I think is their shared conceptual space. Now, and as this conversation unfolds, the two communicators have to work to keep their conceptual structures aligned with one another, and that provides them with a shared context for selecting and interpreting behaviors that can be mutually understood. Now, in fact, by exploiting what they know in the moment, what this shared space that they have just generated, they can actually generate plausible hypotheses about even novel signals or even novel behaviors, such as when the customer would hear maybe for the first time the word fiber. It would be hard to interpret that or make an inference about the meaning of it without this shared conceptual space. So needless to say, our ability to align concepts with others probably also holds the key to understanding how we learn linguistic signals in the first place. Okay. You might say, well, that sounds great. What's the evidence for shared conceptual spaces? Well, admittedly, there isn't much. It's largely uncharted territory, but I'm going to present you today a couple of studies that we have done in this direction. And to be precise, we have tested 4 predictions of shared conceptual spaces across 2 brain imaging and 2 brain interference studies. And the 4 predictions are as follows. Achieving mutual understanding should evoke neural activity, reflecting flexible conceptual processes in regions known to support conceptual knowledge. So we should see activity, not say in visual or sensory motor cortex when people communicate, but in regions like the temporal cortex and the prefrontal cortex who are known to support flexible conceptual processing. Second, there should be shared patterns of neural activity during communicative production and comprehension, given that both these processes relate to the same conversational context. So put differently, there should be an overlap, a neural overlap between communicative production and communicative comprehension. And three, the timing of this shared neural pattern should lead, not follow, the occurrence of a communicative signal, given that the conceptual space is defined by the ongoing communicative interaction rather than by the signal itself. So put differently, we interpret communicative signals in a conceptual frame of reference defined by previous interactions, and that knowledge is held online as we communicate. And four, the temporal dynamics of this shared neural pattern should reflect the communicators' adjustments of their shared conceptual space. So that is, we should see shared neural dynamics related not to the signal, but to the joint development of the conceptual space. Okay, so how then can we test these predictions in the lab? It's obvious that we need to combine live communication involving at least two subjects with brain recording techniques. But how do we get reliable access to the conversational context that people create in communication? And one way to do this is by stripping everyday conversations of face-to-face contact, but also language and other social conventions, while also, and this is important, while preserving the collaborative and open-ended nature of communication. And this is actually the general approach taken in the field of experimental semiotics, where the main idea is that if we immerse human dyads in novel, typically game-like communicative settings, we can get more reliable access to the process of meaning making in communication. For instance, it would allow us to more objectively measure each behavior, since they are taking place on the computer screen, without having, for instance, to determine whether a cough, a nod, or even a verbal silence is relevant for the communication, which is something you would have to do if you studied multimodal conversations. We also gain control over people's communicative history without having to distinguish between the process of joint meaning making from, say, the reproduction of conventional elements retrieved from memory, such as language. Now, our moderator, Bruno Cantucci, is actually one of the pioneers of this field, and you can find more about it in his paper on the past, the present, and the future of experimental semiotics in a recent book chapter that he wrote. Now, our task has been built in this along this framework. So it tries to take all the benefits from experimental semiotics. And if you try to do that, and you add also the ability to measure mutual understanding on an interaction by interaction basis, and the ability to record neural activity while people play the game, then you will end up with this game, which is called the tested communication game. So let me walk you through this game. It doesn't look like actual interaction maybe, but I will hopefully make a convincing case that it captures fundamental aspects of how we coordinate meeting and communication. The game is as follows. The goal is for the two players to reproduce a spatial configuration of their two given shapes. Right? So the blue player controls the blue shape, the orange player controls the orange shape. In this case, the blue player controls a circle and she has a triangle. Now, the two have to reproduce this configuration, but the issue is that this information is shown to one of the players only, making him the communicator of that trial and making her the addressee. He has 5 seconds available when he presses his start button to move his shape across the game board. somehow signal to his partner that she has to end up here facing down, while also making sure within the same amount of time that he ends up here. Now his movements will be visible on her screen. She can interpret those movements and she's trying to make sense of them and try to infer from him that she has to end up in the top left facing down. If they manage to reproduce that, positive feedback is presented. Let me first show you this in action. So it goes to the top left. It goes very fast. Okay, that one probably a little fast. Let me show you one more time what he's doing. So he goes to the position where she needs to end up, so the top left. And, oh. Goes there, steps out a few times. To indicate the orientation, and she understands the behavior as, okay, I need to probably be in the top left facing down because you stepped out. Now, this might look easy. Let's see if we can try it ourselves. I will probably rely on you, Saline or Bruno, to play the game here because I can't see the chat anymore. So here you're effectively taking the role of the receiver, the addressee, because you're not seeing the planning anymore. I've turned off the screen of the communicator. So here it comes. Okay, let me pause that. Bruno, Saline, do you want to take a guess as to where the orange triangles should go?
I would say the bottom row, central column, maybe like pointing up.
Yeah, okay, good. That's a good guess. Let me show you the outcome. It's actually the same location as before, but this tells you how hard this is, right? Yeah, let me do one more now. Okay, here's a final one. Okay, here it comes. Pause that. What do you think, Bruno?
This is fun to play. I mean, it's bottom row, leftmost column, maybe again facing, I mean, pointing up.
Yeah, good call. Let's see. It's I cheated a little bit. I was showing you 3 different pairs playing the same trial. Right, so you can see that pairs end up with converging on quite different solutions that are very hard to interpret outside context. So it tells you that in this game you need context. Second, you don't need any context, you need the right context, right? You need to know specifics of the interaction. And this is, for instance, nicely demonstrated by a wiggle behavior that you saw where people step out to indicate orientation. It's actually really hard to tell whether that stepping out motion, for instance, means you got to step out in this direction that I'm kind of stepping out, like emphatically, or whether the number of times that people step out, whether that corresponds to the number that the receiver needs to rotate the shape in order to reach the target orientation. And in fact, we've even seen cases where people step in. So the number of stepping in movements seem to count. But the main point is that people converge on quite different solutions here, and that you need this pair-specific context to figure out the meanings of the
take a guess as to...
Saline?
Arjen, I think we're having a delay here.
Okay.
because I'm following you through YouTube.
I see.
And so I'm sorry that I don't know at which point are you right now.
I'm actually done with the movies, but that's fine. Fine. I'll continue.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so we have a bit of a delay here. Let me show you. So I just showed you now that context matters and it's pair-specific context. But let me give you a sense of how dynamic this conversational context is in the game, just like it is in everyday interactions. So I've now got 3 more movies for you. And these are all movies of one and the same pair, but on different trials, right? So we've got trial 10 here, we've got trial 25, and we've got trial 27. And what you might notice is the similarity in the target position of the receiver between trial 10 and trial 27. Okay, watch this. I'm going to show you trial 10 first. Okay, so she needs to end up palm left facing right, and he's controlling a rectangular shape. So he goes there, he rotates, which is dysfunctional for his own target location because he needs to rotate again. And she understands this, okay, I probably need to rotate there. Now, let me show you trial 27. Which is a highly similar problem configuration, and we're only 17 trials later in time. This time he goes there and he steps up. He doesn't rotate anymore. And she understands this as well. So this is weird, right? So my question, of course, would be, why did this pair abandon a previously successful strategy? Because that doesn't make any sense from a reinforcement learning or associative learning perspective, where if you have a solution, you stick to it. Yet here, people abandon a previously successful solution. Now, I don't have the full answer as to the reason why they do this, but I can show you what happened right before that change in strategy. So let me show you what happened on trial 25, which is 2 trials before 27. And what you might see here already is that the communicator is no longer controlling a rectangle, but he has a circular shape. Of course, you cannot rotate with a circular shape. And that forces him to introduce a new signal, and which is being understood by his partner. And I guess the pair then decided, okay, well, let's generalize this solution on a different problem to a problem that we already had a solution for, given maybe our recent cognitive context. So people can flexibly generalize solutions across different problem configurations in its task. Okay, so you might ask, okay, well, the game still, it doesn't really look like everyday or natural dialogue. And true, it superficially doesn't look like that. However, I hope that you understand by stripping everyday dialogues of language and gestures and other social conventions, the game is still able to capture core interpersonal processes that underlie our ability to employ those tools, those linguistic tools in the first place, or to employ them in a contextually appropriate manner. Okay, so what's different in the communication game is that subjects can only communicate using a single communication channel, but this provides us with experimental control over the communicated behaviors. It allows us to log and measure accurately each behavior. And the pairs also lack access to pre-existing conventions such as language, and that way we gain control over people's shared communicative history. We can manipulate that history. We can reintroduce problems where we know they already have a common ground for instance. We can also track how performance improves during social interaction and to what extent and how people are able to build on what they know, which is defined by their previous interactions. And third, the roles, production and comprehension here, are experimentally controlled. And this allows us to test our second prediction of an overlap between production and comprehension. But what's important is that the thing that is identical is the dynamic and joined coordination of a conversational context in this game. And this context is of course jointly built, and it's updated in our minds as we interact. And so to sustain this dynamic process, this dynamicity, we typically increase task difficulty across successive interactions by introducing problems that require increasingly more coordination. And you've seen a few examples already, where, for instance, we introduce a wiggle or a triangle pointing in a certain direction, and people have to say converge on the wiggle or something else. If they did converge on the wiggle, we can have the triangle point outward of the game board, and stepping outside the game board is no longer possible. So that these kind of tricks force people to keep negotiating what they think they know instead of just exploiting all that knowledge already. Okay, oh yeah, if you're interested in trying out this game, we build a web version that you can find at mutualunderstanding.nl. You have to invite a friend to play the game with you. Okay, let's return then to our predictions, because we said that we would expect neural activity in brain areas that support flexible conceptual processes, and two, that these brain processes should be shared across production and comprehension, given that both of them relate to the conversational context. So we tested these predictions in an MEG study, where we also took into account the neural activity on the control task that I show you here. I'm not going to go through the details of this task here. It's a difficult task where people have to solve individual problems instead of joint problems. So the task looks the same. It has the same responses, and also between subject dependencies. For instance, as a salesman, people had to plan a path across the game board in order to solve a complex puzzle. As a road worker, they needed to fix the path created by the salesman, and they had to solve their problem given some predefined rules. So both players had predefined rules to solve their task, and there are between subject dependencies, but there are no communicative necessities between the tasks. There's no build-up of a conversational context. So we recorded MEG from both these tasks, and participants alternated between the communicator and addressee roles on a trial-by-trial basis, which allowed us to study production and comprehension in a subject. And then they would do the same thing for non-communicative production and comprehension in the instrumental interaction, the control task. And what we did is we focused on moments where people plan communicative behaviors. So the idea being that here as a communicator, you have to plan an action that can be understood by your partner. That process is not supposed to take place when you plan communicative actions as a salesman. And what we found is that if you draw this contrast, is that regions like the temporal lobe, but also the ventral medial prefrontal cortex, they support planning communicative actions as compared to non-communicative actions. Now, we made a similar contrast for the observation roles. And here we contrasted between the addressee and the road worker. Again, the difference being, as an addressee, you try to interpret behaviors hypothetically according to what you think you both know, the conversational context, whereas as a salesman, you don't. Now, the sensory inputs and the motor outputs are quite different across the two individual tasks, the communicating addressee. So there are trivial differences between the two. But if you draw this contrast between the addressee and the road worker, what you actually see is you get the same brain regions that support also communicative comprehension in the temporal cortex and ventral medial prefrontal cortex. So this answers already our first two predictions. Both production and comprehension are supported by brain regions known to support conceptual processes. And second, this neuroactivity is it's shared across production and comprehension. The question that leaves us that's open still is like, okay, is this neuroactivity modulated by the communicative signal or by the ongoing communicative interaction, consistent with our third prediction, right? Specifically, we predict that we should see a shared neural pattern already before the occurrence of a signal, given that we use the conceptual space defined by the ongoing interaction to both select and interpret communicative signals. So we used MEG again. We used actually the same data set, and we used MEG's temporal resolution to see what's happening in these core brain regions that support communication. Now, planning times and movement times in this task are variable. So what we did is we time locked activity to the moments where communicators started planning communicative behaviors, where target configuration was presented. In the baseline, an empty game board was presented. And we time locked until to when they started moving and producing their actions. We did this both for the communicator and the salesman. And we also did this for the road worker and the addressee, where we actually time locked activation to when the communicator started moving on the game board. And again, baseline is an empty game board in both settings. And we time locked until when the addressee started planning her own actions. Okay, now I'm going to show you 3 brain regions: the posterior SCS, the ventromedia prefrontal cortex, and the temporal lobe. I'm going to go through this quite quickly. The main thing I want you to take home from this is that there's a general offset in activity on top of, in some brain regions, task-specific modulation. So let me first show you the posterior SCS. And you can see this offset is already here before the dashed line, T0, when just an empty game board is presented across both tasks. And this offset is present both when you are about to plan actions and when you're about to observe actions. Differently between the two is that the posterior SCS seems to be also sensitive to demands that occur early when during planning, when the target configuration is presented, and that rise over the course of the production or the observation of the behaviors and the interpretation thereof. So based on this temporal profile, we reasoned that this area might be necessary to interpret behaviors according to the recent communicative history. And to test this, we stimulated or we interfered with functioning in this area using TMS. And we indeed saw that if you perturb functioning in the posterior SCS, that people are less able to benefit from the recent communicative history. A second temporal profile was seen in the ventromedia prefrontal cortex. And you can see it's, again, the offset is here in both situations, but the temporal dynamics are quite different from the posterior SCS in that the ventromedia prefrontal cortex is sensitive to planning related demands, right? In fact, when you start observing actions, activity goes down from baseline levels until when you start planning your own actions. So we hypothesized that maybe this region supports our communicative planning or communicative decision-making by guiding it with knowledge of the interaction. And this is indeed what we saw in a sample of prefrontal lesion patients, that these patients struggled or no longer actually adjusted their communicative behavior to what they knew about a communication partner, knowledge implied in the communicative interaction. Now, the third region and final region that we saw was a inferior section of the temporal lobe. And interestingly, activity in this region doesn't show any transient effects related to the task. It seems that this activity is just generally upregulated throughout the communication. And you can again see that this offset is clearly visible before the dashed line here, both when you're about to produce or plan an action or when you're observing them, before you're observing them. So we wondered if this task state, this cognitive set, if neuroactivity thereof could also predict communicative difficulties during the task as captured by planning times. So what we did is we took this baseline neuroactivity across the whole brain and correlated that with planning times at a later stage of an interaction. And we indeed found that this region, again, seems to predict those planning times in the communicative task, but not in the non-communicative task. So this suggests that the right temporal lobe supports our interactive behaviors in a state-dependent manner. Okay, that answers our third prediction. All three temporal profiles are consistent with the idea that communicative production and comprehension rely on neuroactivity defined by the ongoing interaction rather than by the signal itself. Which leads us to our final prediction, namely is that these shared neural patterns should be shared dynamically across subjects when people are adjusting their shared conceptual space, right? So if I were to give the same talk tomorrow again, we would have probably perfect understanding, but there will be less coordination involved. Whereas during everyday conversations, since we are generating this knowledge together, this shared conceptual space, we continuously need to evaluate what we think we both know in the conversation, and we can only update our knowledge as soon as we think that we agree on it. So seen over the time course of a whole conversation, you would expect to see the shared accumulations, the shared developments of conceptual knowledge, but only when people are doing this, when they are coordinating. So that's our final prediction here. And in order to test this prediction, we have two people play the game from inside two scanners. This time the roles were fixed, such that the communicator was always the communicator and the receiver was always the receiver. And the pairs played 80-something communicative interactions that each lasted about 20 seconds. These details are important, the 20 seconds, I'll get back to that. And during a single interaction, each subject would execute his or her actions once, right? They would use their handheld controller, and specifically the right thumb and right index fingers to control the shape movements. So as a proof of principle, we wondered, can we actually find brain-to-brain synchrony between the left sensory motor cortices of two subjects, driven by the periodic usages of their right hands? And the answer is yes, of course you can. In fact, you can see this is a single pair that I'm showing you. So I'm showing you here about 15 trials, each lasting about 20 seconds. And you can see that the sensory motor cortex of the communicator precedes that of the addressee in a consistent manner across interactions. And you might ask, okay, how can we quantify this? Well, to do this, we borrow a technique from electrophysiology, which is called coherent spectral density analysis, which is basically a way to capture correlation in the frequency domain. So it gives you the amount of synchrony per frequency. So here, intersubject coherence on the y-axis, basically the correlation per frequency. And what you can see is that there's a peak in the coherence spectrum at 0.05 hertz. Now, this is not a biologically meaningful rhythm. 0.05 hertz corresponds to 1 divided by 20 seconds. It's actually the interaction frequency of the task. So you might ask, okay, well, is that interesting? You find brain-to-brain coupling, if you will, in a pair during communication. This must be meaningful, right? Well, if you want to know whether this coupling is relevant for communication and relevant for understanding one another, what you need to do is, of course, manipulate and measure understanding over the course of trials and see whether this coupling predicts that. So that's what we did. We had people play so-called known trials and so-called novel trials during the task. And the novel trials were trials that they had never faced before. They had to coordinate a meeting for them. Whereas the known trials were trials that they already had established shared solutions for during a pre-scan session, a training session. And you can see that behavioral manipulation worked. People were at seeding level for these known trials for which they already had common ground, and they got better over the course of the experiment, over the course of the novel trials, despite that we kept introducing as many novel problems as possible. Now, are there any brain regions that track this mutual understanding, that support mutual understanding in communication? Now, if you make a contrast between the known and the novel trials, you will end up with the same right lateralized frontotemporal network that we found in the MEG study. If you additionally look for areas that are not just more active during known trials, but also track the rate of success over the course of the novel trials, then you will end up with the right superior temporal gyrus in a subregion in this frontotemporal network. And you can see that in both communicators, planning communicative behaviors, but also in addressees observing those behaviors, this region tracks their level of understanding. So now that we have identified brain regions that support communication or understanding in communication, we can ask, okay, but how does this region contribute to mutual understanding? Does it care about the details of the signals, or does it care about dynamically adjusted conversational context? So to investigate that, we again use coherent spectral density analysis. But before showing you the result, I'm going to show you the dynamics in a representative pair here. And what you can see is that the STG signals coming from the communicator are synchronous with that of the addressee, but also that the wavelengths that these signals are really slow. They're much slower than the interaction by interaction dynamics that we see here. You can see that these wavelengths span multiple interactions. You can quantify this using coherence analysis again. And what you see is that there's maximal coherence in real pairs at frequencies that are slower than the interaction frequency, again indicated with a dashed line here. And this is important for theory because it suggests that the communicative meaning of a signal is not evoked by the signal itself. So we have a brain region that tracks mutual understanding. This region is not sensitive to the occurrences of individual communicative signals. But what does this region, what does it do then? And how does it relate to our prediction, where we said that we would see coherence only when people are communicating or basically are coordinating shared knowledge? Now, to test this, I have one more final analysis for you. And it's a little complicated analysis, but I'll give it a try. So what we did is, basically I'm here showing you the neural traces again. And this time I've also labeled the type of the interaction. And you can see these are two novel types, whereas here we have two known types. And you can see that activity goes up as you figure out that you have conversational context that you can use for communication. And you can see actually that the dynamics of this region tracks the type of the trials throughout the entire conversation, but in a state-like manner, follows the blocks basically. And you can estimate this activity of the blocks by using a model-based analysis where you model each block with one regressor, and you also account and regress out variance related to the task itself. Right? So you're basically extracting task states here by per block. Now, if you do that, you end up with a vector of task states over the course of novel trials, but also over the course of known trials. And you can correlate those task states, which basically capture shared fluctuations in task states. And if you do that, you'll find that the task states are correlated in real pairs, but only when people were developing a shared conversational context, not when they already had a shared conversational context. So where they understood each other perfectly fine, except they were not coordinating what they knew anymore. Right? So you have a brain region that tracks mutual understanding, is not sensitive to individual signals, and its synchrony is driven by the joint development of a conversational context. Okay, so how much time do I have? Okay, so so taken together, these findings suggest that the communicative meaning of a signal is not a property of a signal itself, which challenges common theories of language and communication. Those theories also lack an explanation for how we can even generate or understand new signals, like the word fiber, as we saw, but also understand new signals in the task that are being used in the field of experimental semiotics. And it's still early days, but the findings also point out that the meaning is probably a property of a mutually coordinated conceptual space in which people use their signals as a tool to control that coordination process. You can find more about this conceptual alignment framework in the paper listed below it. But I can imagine that at this point you might ask, okay, that's great, but why is this relevant? Well, I skipped over it, but the conceptual alignment framework has already cast some light on the social conduct deficits in prefrontal lesions, but also more recently in individuals with autism. And I will try to squeeze in some results of that study right now. And so this is basically, I'm going to briefly highlight the findings of that study. And what we found is that when pairs that contain one or more autistic individuals, the ASD and mixed pairs here, solved fewer communicative problems in the game than neurotypical pairs. So put differently, the communicative impairments of autism persist in interactions stripped of face-to-face and verbal contact, suggesting that these factors cannot explain the daily difficulties experienced by autistic individuals. I should also mention here that the communication impairment could not be explained by a reduced cognitive flexibility or a lack of social motivation, because individuals with autism were equally inclined to adjust their communicative behavior following a misunderstanding compared to neurotypical pairs. And they would also spontaneously put more emphasis on these relevant locations on the game board purely for the benefit of their partner. So they were trying really hard to get communication going. And essentially they matched all the metrics that we looked at. Planning times, movement times, you name it, they were matched across the board. The problem of communication only became visible when we interpret the behaviors in the pair specific, basically the pair level instead of individual level. I'm going to show you that next because we computed this measure of pairwise alignment, which captures a pair's ability to rapidly use the same behavior or the same signal on consecutive interactions. And they could only do this in some cases if they understood the same meaning for that signal, right? So if you introduce a certain wiggling behavior, like we saw with the example, it's very hard to interpret what it means. And in order to reproduce and use the signal in the same way on the next trial, you have to be able to quickly align on that new behavior. Now here you can see the pairwise alignment scores of neurotypicals and plotted over the full series of interactions. And you can also see the alignment dynamics of autistic individuals, which is much lower than that of neurotypical in pairs. So now let me add, let me add the dynamics of pseudo pairs. So pseudo pairs are members taken from different pairs. So pseudo pairs were engaged in the same task, but they lacked the opportunity to coordinate a shared communicative context since they were not playing the game together. And the fact that autistic individuals tracked the alignment dynamics of pseudo pairs suggests that they struggle to converge rapidly on a shared meaning especially when meaning required referencing the shared communicative context. And by contrast, as these interaction spaces show, neurotypical pairs shown on the right here, they always align their signal use with that of their partner, resulting in strongly interconnected spaces between each other's signals, as seen here on the right. So the blue lines here, so these are two pairs, and the blue lines connect the signals produced by player one, and the orange lines connect the signals produced by player two. And you can see that there are a lot of shared solutions that they both would visit a lot. Whereas on the left-hand side, you have the two interacting spaces of autistic pairs. And what you can see is that they relatively navigated the space of possibilities in an individual manner, resulting in largely segregated interaction spaces. And it's not that, for instance, neurotypical pairs or neurotypical subjects explore possibilities on their own. Like here, you have the K, you have I, and H, but they don't pursue that solution if they notice that their partner doesn't follow them into it. So put differently, autistic communication appears to be less aligned to that of a partner. And of course, we hypothesize that this is because they struggle to align on the conceptual structures of the interaction with the partner. Okay, this final slide is to give you a glimpse of the work we're currently doing. Of course, we're trying to build more bridges to the clinical domain here. Currently, we're combining our dual fMRI setup with our autism study to find out whether indeed their communicative abilities can be predicted by an interpersonal misalignment of concepts, misalignment at the level of the conversational context, and on a more neuromechanistic side, we are performing intracranial studies in neurosurgical patients to understand how conceptual spaces are instantiated but also updated during communication. And these intracranial signals have high spatial temporal precision, but also high single trial or single interaction precision. And we hope that this makes them ideal for studying the dynamics and the representations of conceptual knowledge in communication. Now, of course, overall, my hope is that the two research lines combined will provide a neural infrastructure for understanding neurotypical and autistic communication. Now, on that note, I'm wrapping up, and I would like to thank you for your alignment and for building a shared conceptual space with me. I should also mention that if you are interested in how human minds meet and you find yourself asking questions like, what is in a signal? What is a signal really? Or what counts as context? I could recommend you have a look at our recently freshly minted book chapter titled Joint Epistemic Engineering. And in it, we take a deep dive into the long neglected process of context construction in communication, and also how it underpins our ability to engineer any conversation, including that bar conversation that we talked about, but also how it allows us to engineer or bootstrap new communication systems, as we saw in the test communication game. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Arjen. It's a great talk. I really enjoyed it. Learned a lot. Bruno, let me introduce you before you go on.
All right.
So our debater, Professor Bruno Galantucci, is a psychologist at Yeshiva University, New York. He directs the lab of experimental semiotics, and his research interests focus on investigating how humans establish and develop new forms of communication. Thanks for being here, Bruno.
Thank you, Celine. Well, thank you, Arjen. It was a beautiful journey. I often had to pause and think, because my thoughts were distracted at the idea of someone like Wittgenstein had been following this talk, and he would be just like, whoa. Right? It's just like
Thanks.
it's great to see like how all these ideas, and once you go there and you do the due diligence of science and you test them one by one, they check one by one, and it's really a pleasure. It has been a real pleasure to be here.
Thanks, Bruno. That's great coming from you.
Um, if you could go back, I just thought I have a number of questions. I just wanted to understand better one of this last slide. Yes, that one.
This one with this.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Can you go over once more and let us appreciate a little bit more in depth what are we seeing here? What are the letters and what are these lines?
Yeah, you're right. I went over that very quickly. So I have to actually back up to this slide actually in order to go to the next one. So people are producing these behaviors, and what we did, we had people rate those behaviors. So we would make a list of possible behaviors, including wiggles to do this, wiggles to do that. And that's actually quite a challenge in itself, as you also know, to label these behaviors. And in fact, when we had other people look at these behaviors, they discovered even newer behaviors. And some of those behaviors are really hard to label, but we gave it a try anyway. We tried to make an as detailed label as possible for all the behaviors. So we had a bit of a vocabulary, if you will, and then we would label all individual behaviors. And so each behavior would get a character like A, B, C, etc. And that would allow us to see whether people were able to use the same signal in the same way across consecutive interactions, because people were alternating between the communicator role on a trial-by-trial basis. If we were playing the game, I could see which behavior I was producing on trial 1, which behavior you were producing on trial 2, and which behavior I was producing on trial 3, and so on. And we would define pairwise alignment as the ability of a pair to use the same behavior across consecutive trials. So if I use the same behavior as you did on the previous trial, on the succeeding trial, then that would count towards an alignment. And then you can calculate alignment. You can create an alignment vector over trials, if you will. And that's what's shown here.
So that will be one of the orange lines that we saw in the next slide. Is that correct?
Right. Yeah.
Okay.
This here, the time dimension is lost because I've just plotted all these are basically actually this is not alignment. This is like you said, these are the signals that they would produce, right? So just zooming in on say the top right solution space here. I can't see where the blue lines start, but it must start somewhere. Oh, this is actually maybe the start or the end. And you can see that the subject would go from A to A, and then maybe C, maybe to other. It will produce other types of signals, and that's player 1. The other player, so that's maybe me. The other player, maybe you'll be the orange player. You will also have a trajectory in interaction space. And what I've done here, we have grouped the signals according to the same type. So you can see whether people visit the same type of solutions together or not. And you can see already just by how interconnected these solution spaces are on the right, you see there are a lot of shared or jointly visited solutions as compared to the left-hand side where you have the autistic solution spaces and where you can see these clusters that are only visited by individuals. So all the Ks are only produced by the autistic subject. I should add here, this is not that they're not trying to communicate in the same way. They're really adjusting their behavior following a misunderstanding. So this is not the consequence of a reduced flexibility or anything like that. They also, autistic individuals we saw, also put more emphasis or equally amount of emphasis on relevant bits of the game board in their behaviors, just like neurotypicals would do. So these segregated solution spaces are not due to lack of motivation or cognitive flexibility. It's just that they struggle to find each other in communication like somehow neurotypicals are able to do. And that's why I highlighted some of these individual strategies, individual behaviors here, like K and I. So neurotypical individuals are not just sticking with what they know, they also are forced to explore in the task, like just how we are forced to explore in conversations. But they don't pursue following or pursue producing a particular behavior if they notice that their partner is not following them into it. And then they go back to or go somewhere else based on what they know. So the neurotypical pairs are navigating the solution space together as compared to the autistic individuals.
Right.
Is that more clear?
Yeah, yes. Great, thank you. It seems to me that like what you're describing is like these typical pairs create a sort of a meta entity, which is their pair, and that is what is directing the whole process of coordination. If you don't create that
Right.
meta space, then it's like two individual, they might end up like occasionally aligning in some ways, but if they don't create that like super the super individual, it becomes very hard.
Yeah, that's a good point. And just to build off of that, we have seen autistic pairs that were highly successful in our task. They were outliers, but they would accidentally kind of converge on a great strategy that would help them throughout the task early on. And so still you can be successful in communication if you happen to hit understanding in an unfortunate way. But yes, when coordination becomes important and you need some kind of meta representation of the conversation, that's where it gets tricky for them in general.
Right. And then you get stuck. We've seen this in my lab too, that because then you don't have a plan B.
Right.
You throw this thing, if it works, it works. If it doesn't, then you don't know where to go because there is no space where that can happen. Yes.
Quite hard, yeah.
Yes.
So I should emphasize here that if you investigate the behaviors of autistic individuals individually in this task, you will not find any differences. They produce the same types of signals. There's the same variety of signals. There's nothing different there. It's only when you look at the coordination level here is where you start to see the differences.
Yeah, I think I would say that is the difference is what is that signal in relation to. That is what makes the whole difference there. Yes.
May I ask a question about this as well?
Of course.
Arjen, so you were looking at what kind of behavior? It's a verbal behavior or it's a game behavior with no conversation?
Yeah. So in this game, I should have mentioned this more clearly, that people are sitting in separate rooms. So they're not able to see each other, not able to talk to each other. The only communication channel that they have are the shape movements on the computer screen.
So it's not verbal behavior at all. So you can actually, this is great because if you look at autism or schizophrenia, you see that they do have a problem in conversation, in communication, and it might reflect the problem you were showing us. But they also have a combinatorial problem. They have a hard time putting, words together to form a sentence, for example. They have a poor structure. But so here, what you did, you excluded this possibility.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
Not a problem within the grammar, is the problem in building a context.
Yeah, right. So indeed, if you go back to that first one, so I didn't put too much emphasis on this, but it is, I guess, important for some theories in the field of autism research who have highlighted perceptual details or linguistic abilities. If linguistic abilities were the cause of the communicative difficulties, then they should be fine in this task. They should have equal performance to neurotypicals, which is not what we see. So, yeah.
So let me ask you probably a question that is a bit harder, but do you think that a problem in building this shared conceptual space can lead to a problem in linguistics? So do you think that, you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, I think the fact that we are picking up on this in our task and the effect sizes are huge. We're talking about 2.5 standard deviations of differences on some task metrics, so pretty strong effects. While at the same time, autistic individuals are also known to do really well on some linguistic tasks in the lab or in the clinic. or also certain theory of mind tasks. So it's possible that individuals who or linguistically fluent autistic individuals who have mastered a good command of language, basically, they might pass those tasks, but they might still struggle in our tasks because they're missing that specific component of building a context, which is maybe also something that explains why they struggle to employ their linguistic tools in a contextually appropriate manner in everyday situations.
All right, so let me press you a little bit more on this this question. You talked about ambiguity, like the word back, lexical ambiguity.
Right.
So if you write about autism here, your prediction is that they will struggle with lexical ambiguity because they can use the shared conceptual space, to understand it, but they won't have that much of a problem with structural ambiguity because it's more, fixed by the structure, by the linguistic properties of the system. Is that right?
Well, yeah, almost. I think you hit an important point here, because lexical ambiguity, it presupposes that you can choose between a set of options, where often in open-ended conversational settings, the set of options are not defined. So if you force me to choose between, the referent of a word bank as the river bank or basketball shot or something else, I might still be able to resolve which one you're referring to based on some cues in the context. However, if you use bank in a completely novel way, and there are no predefined sets of options that I can choose from, then you have a completely different type of ambiguity. And it becomes very hard to constrain that problem because you're no longer selecting between options. You are generating an option that didn't maybe exist before. So communicative ambiguity can be much wider than just linguistic ambiguity.
I spend a lot of time talking to 2 years old these days, and if I didn't have that kind of, and probably I don't have that kind of flexibility to follow the creativity that he uses to connect his few words and few sounds to the things that are out there in the world, it will be like, and it is possible, and it happens on the spot, and it is often really very hard to believe that such a small mind can make such big leaps in connecting things that are just like there is always, if you move around a conceptual space hard enough for a long time enough, you will find a connection that will totally surprise you. And the fact that kids are doing this, I think, it's a suggestion to what really the mechanism is, and they communicate. They get their stuff very, very well out with minimal vocabulary.
There's a huge component of innovation to communication, of course, and that's what Chilner is still very good at, I guess. But that's very hard to capture in tasks, and so that's why I think where experimental semiotics comes into place.
Now,
okay. No, sorry. Can I ask a question to both of you? I want to see your ideas about this. You're saying, Bruno and Arjen Stolk, made me think that this ability might be somehow innate and somehow depending on social interactions. It's a game between biology and environment, culture. So do you think that animals in general have this ability, maybe a much less complex one, more, let's say, primitive version of this human ability? How do you see this?
You want to go first, Bruno?
Well, it's a very difficult question. I think the answer is, well, could be that it's not a matter of kind, it's a matter of degree. And I think if you go in certain species, I was recently reading this book by Carl Safina, he's an anthropologist who spent a lot of time with researcher who in turn spend a lot of time with animals. For example, someone spent like 30 years doing research in loco, in situ with elephants, and someone else spent like under 2 decades doing research with dolphins. And they will know the individuals one by one. They know the history of the group. They know the history of the land and everything that happened. And when you start listening to their stories, you will see that the level of communication that these creatures have, when you know how to listen, when you know how to tap into that process, is quite developed and it's quite complex. Elephants, for example, make jokes, and the same thing like when we see one another after a long period of time, and we have that moment of explosion, they do the same, and then they also know what's going on around them. So, for example, when the poachers arrive, they will communicate in the entire space. They have this infrasound that they will create with their foot stamping on the ground that travels very long distances. And so the other groups, the other families of elephant will run toward the house of the guardian. So they use this signal in very complex and sophisticated ways. And the same for dolphins. One of the stories that gave me the idea of the richness of this was that this woman was going down in the Bahamas. And she has a good job. Like she does her research in a scuba diving outfit in the Bahamas, playing with dolphins. And she does this she has been doing this for like 2 decades now. And now she brings her students there, her PhD students. They go down and they spend time with this family of dolphins. And what they sometimes do, as humans do, they will misbehave with the kids. Try to go on the playground and do something with a child or someone else, and it's wrong. You see their reaction. So dolphins will make an intervention very quickly when that happens, when the students misbehave with a baby. And the way they do this intervention is they use their fin as a sort of a slapping device. Right? They give a gentle slap but they don't give the gentle slap on the head of the student. They give the gentle lap on the head of the professor. They've understood that group has some social dynamics inside them, and the best way to intervene on that group is to intervene on the lady on top. And this is telling you that I think they have. I mean, from my point of view, this shows me that they have the stuff that you need to do the things that Arjen was describing. The problem is that in order for us to make meaningful research on this, you need to do this kind of stuff. You need to learn. There is a I don't know, a human, I would say, a human because I am a human, but there is a sharing. You need to enter the world of these people, of these entities, of these animals completely. You have to understand their feelings. You have to understand their motivation, their history, and then you will start realizing that possibly there is a closer gap than we think. That's
right. You have to
5
be a
minutes answer.
Yeah. That's super interesting. Yeah.
Arjen, what is your answer? Now I'm curious.
Well, I think I agree with you. Just probably in the sense that I also suspect that there's maybe a continuum. Whereas if you look, for instance, at honeybees, which have a certain dance, and the angle of the dance, the circles they make according towards the sun, that angle corresponds to how far other bees need to fly out from the nest, etc. And so they have like a fixed code such that a South African honeybee can be understood in a New Zealand beehive. I think on the other side of the spectrum, we have us humans, where we have a lot more flexibility to our communication, and which presumably relies on, I think, our ability to rapidly integrate potentially unrelated concepts, right? Such as we did today, where we have now a conceptual space that spans knowledge of autism, but also fMRI and MEG and even ASIMO, which were initially unrelated concepts, but they come together in a conversation typically And we also need to keep that rich conceptual space flexibly aligned with our communication partner at all times, right? We need to continuously revise it. We need to continuously adjust its granularity as where we learn more in-depth knowledge about the thing we're talking about, like just how we learned about dolphins. So so there's a lot more conceptual integration demands on human communication, I think, than you will see in, say, in bees and other animals. But that would probably there would probably, like Bruno was saying, maybe there is a continuum, and there are animals that are closer to us in terms of that flexibility.
Right, thank you. Yes, I think that a continuum is a great way of seeing many things. Thank you.
Thanks.
I had another question. If you have more time, or you tell me when you like to stop. It, it seems to me that there is part of this construction of shared conceptual space that occurs. Well, there may be like more than one layer. Like, so there is what you do on the fly, right? When you are in the here and now and you're having a conversation.
Mm-hmm.
Then there is what you do when you belong to a certain community, to a certain culture, to a certain for a period of time. And then there is what you have because that we have the biological endowment that we have, and the planet is what it is, like the share ontology, I would call it. It seems to me that, for example, when you start communicating with a baby, the share ontology is really important, right? The fact that the world seems to be cut out in ways that are very similar, maybe not exactly fully aligned, but they're already very similar. Like I see a table there, I see a chair, I don't see the elements, the parts, and I see objects, I see events, I see, and this seems to be very well aligned, and it's just this is how our perceptual system works, our conceptual system works. So when now you are at that bar and you're ordering that coffee, to which extent do you think these three layers play a role? Like, or maybe in certain contexts you have one of them plays more a role and the other. Like, I just wanted to see what your thoughts are on this idea.
Yeah, that's deep, Bruno. Like, I'm used from you. I think just to draw a little bit closer to that conversation, the bar conversation, I think we're not just aligning on word meanings, right? We're aligning also on social attitudes, maybe. And for instance, just to give you an example, I'm not sure if you ever played the game of, I think it's called Code Word, where you have to come up with a word that can be understood by your team players, your team partners. And after a while, you kind of figure out how abstract people are willing to think. Like, are they willing to take risks? And because if you choose the wrong, if you select a word and the other one misinterprets it and flips the wrong card, your team can lose. So you have to walk a fine balance, and you have to kind of get a feel for how far out your team players want to think. Because the more cards the right cards you can flip, the more likely your team is to win. And so you're basically pressed for extreme alignment, if you will, right? So you have to align on different levels, not just directly on the words themselves, but you have to figure out like how far is this person wanting to go. And I think a lot of our conversations are more about alignment, about certain stances or certain beliefs beyond what you might read from the lines themselves. So between the lines, there's a lot of coordination at this super abstract level taking place, which might have to do with some of the things you say, our ontology, who we are, to what group we belong. All of that might be at stake in a conversation.
It might be interesting to check these things also at the neural level. Jonas Nolle and I were talking about, he has been doing some research on using virtual reality to do this experimental semiotic stuff. And there, the beauty is that you can really manipulate everything. The way in which you see the world might be quite different from the way I see the world. And I was wondering, we never really got, then there were, COVID and so on and so forth. We didn't really got very far with that idea. But if we, and maybe he is on his own, but like if anybody will develop this experimental semiotics game in which you can change the ontology, I'll be very curious for you guys to run it in a magnet to see like which part of the of the brain is gonna be suffering because now there is no longer an alignment in fundamental ontology. Do you have any intuition?
Well, there's these famous primary experiments where they try to incite in people beliefs about belonging to certain groups because based on their eye color or something like that. And and then that can have very detrimental effects on how people behave towards people that don't have the same eye color, for instance. And the important thing is that there's something in us that allows us to, have this strong but still flexible group association, this group forming ability, which then of course influences how we perceive the world and suddenly paying attention to the colors of an eye. It's something you might have never noticed before in another person. But how to manipulate that, I wouldn't.
Well, we were actually thinking something a bit more radical, and that is where you see a circle, I see a triangle. Where you see red, I see blue.
Mm-hmm.
Where you see up, I see left.
Mm-hmm,
See?
mm-hmm.
And then there are various degrees in which I can put a wedge between your perception, the perception of reality of A and the perception of reality of B. One question here will be at which point does these things break down? Because I think at a certain point, if the ontologies are really different, it'll become almost impossible to be talking about them. But there is that gray area before you get there.
Mm-hmm.
And I was wondering, which part of the brain will be hard at work to try to understand the ontology of someone else.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if you see this same brain areas that we see here, right? Where this is a highly generative capability you're talking about, and it's about, how you conceptualize the world around you, which I think loads on these, and these temporal pole regions in the right temporal cortex, for instance. But if you can manipulate that, we can try it out. Yeah,
maybe we should talk with Jonas. He really wanted to use this to do more radical manipulation, and I think this is an interesting direction for the future.
Yeah, for sure.
In a certain sense, what Bruno is proposing is more or less like mixing your pairs. People that have problems with perspective taking with people that do not, right? So if you take, I don't know, a schizophrenia or dementia that has problems with perspective taking, that would do it.
Yeah, that's an interesting idea. It'd be interesting to try and see if that is, because really then you have an intuition about what's going on, that you really are dealing with different ontologies. So of course, once you have a different ontology, I think it becomes very hard to communicate.
Right, yeah.
Well, in a way, it's kind of surprising that we are able to understand each other in the first place, right? Because we all quite different. All our brain anatomies are different. We have our own private perspectives and individual personalized backgrounds, right? So we are all unique individuals. And so the fact that we can quickly represent things in a similar way, I'd be interested to see how far you can take that ability, like how far you really have to go in order for it to break down.
Right. Yeah. Sorry. I have some work done with schizotypy traits, features, and it shows that people that have high levels of schizotypy traits, they do not really, their pragmatic meaning is not really, like typical people with loads of schizotypy traits. So maybe we really don't converge in the same, meaning, but it does not really, it does not create a noise that is big enough to interrupt the communication. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So it's just subclinical in a certain sense. We just don't even perceive it, but it's there.
Okay.
So could you give us an example? I think I know what you mean, but I like to have the texture of it.
We did an experiment with university students, grad students at Duke University. And so we used a questionnaire from psychology to measure schizotypy traits. And then and at the same time, they did a linguistic test to see how good they are in using discourse context to interpret definite DPs. Something like, oh, I met John today. He's studying whales. He told me that the whale sleeps vertically. So that's in Portuguese. And then we asked them, what is the whale he's talking about? And people can say like, oh, he's talking about whales in general. He's talking about the whale he's studying, blah, 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 blah. And when we do this, people with a high load of schizotypy traits, especially negative traits, they have a tendency to hold on to semantic meaning. So they look at the whale and say like, well, it must be a specific whale. So the whale he's studying. Others are more flexible. They say like, well, yeah, I think he's talking about the whale he's studying, but it can also be whales in general.
So do you think that because they have a strong bias towards semantic relationships, that semantic relationships are overrepresented, or are they unable to flexibly adjust their concepts?
I don't know. They show a bias towards semantic meaning, but it might be that it's because they have a hard time in pragmatics, in adjusting, the concept according to the context. So they might have this problem, they might have a problem in building the conceptual space you were proposing. That's an interesting thing, we're talking about subclinical population, people that are around us all the time.
Yeah.
So let me see if I understand that correctly. Do you think that what they are doing is expecting a higher degree of commitment from the speaker? So if you said he study whales and he tells me that the whale lives vertically, they expect that you have to stick to the one most likely interpretation of this sequence, and you cannot really play around. Is that what you're saying?
That's what they do, exactly.
I see. Wow. So their deficit seems to be sort of a hyper pragmatic, or like it's a rigid pragmatic. It's not like a deficient pragmatic.
That's right. They go like this. If the context gives me a clue towards a specific meaning, I'll go with a specific meaning. I will exclude the genetic meaning completely. So this person is talking about a specific whale, not about kinds, right? The kind whale. So they are hyped. It's a kind of hypersensibility to pragmatics. That's true. You were right. So if pragmatics hints towards the semantic meaning, they go for it.
Wow, that's really interesting.
I can send you the paper if you want.
Yes, please. I would like to read more about this.
Both of you,
Okay. Are there any questions from the chat? I cannot see it right here.
No, not really, no.
Okay, cool.
If you want, I have a couple more questions, but we can also leave it at this. I think it's a good place to stop.
Yeah, let's stay in touch, Bruno.
Okay.
About it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Let's get to breakfast.
Yes.
Okay, thanks, Aline and Aberlin, for hosting this.
Thank you, everybody.
You guys got to make sure that you invite Bruno next time.
We will. We love Italians here, so we will. Arjen,
Cool.
thanks a lot for the amazing talk. It's really nice. It's really, pragmatics is a field that has to be more developed. We have to pay more attention to pragmatics and context, as you said. And Bruno, it's a pleasure meeting you. Really nice. And yes, thanks for your questions and for taking your time.
My pleasure. This has been a lot of fun.
Thanks.
Keep up with this work, Arjen. It's really great.
Thanks, Bruno.
I want to read more.
Yeah, we'll try. Yeah, enjoy your nice day, Celine.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Thanks,
Bye
everybody.
bye. Bye bye.